Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andre Rapp. I'm with the Center for Assessment, one of the state partners who is supporting the Cool Council efforts and related assessment work efforts. I'm here also with my colleague, Brian Gong, and I'm the chair of the KBE Working Group on Assessment that you're all a member of. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to go over the principles of the working group and the goals of the working group, and then tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today, what we're going to do in the next few weeks, and give you an overview of some of the assessment foundations that we need in order to do our work. I want to thank Meredith and Jennifer for the support that they have given me in preparing this working session, and I want to also thank Lou for the support that she has given me in double checking a few basic parameters about the work. So with that, I want to first of all tell you what we're going to do today. So as you can see here, we're going to talk a little bit about the essentials of this working group. Then I want to share with you the high-level overview of the survey responses that you've given me. I want to talk about some foundational considerations around assessment, choosing frameworks in particular, and modern conceptions around assessment. I really want us to get on a common page, finding common language for some of the concepts that are floating around, so that before we start engaging in any kind of future-oriented design and principles and the articulation of all of that, I want to make sure that we're also on a similar page, at least, about what the key concepts and directions and opportunities are. And I hope that for you, what happens today is that you feel that there were quite a few concepts that feel familiar to you, but hopefully also some that are new to you, and some ideas that are inspiring to you. And that at the end, you feel like you have a handle on the different system components that we may want to think about in the next few weeks here together. And then we're going to talk about next steps at the end, which is really, in some sense, a little homework that I have for you in preparation for the next meeting. With that being said, let's talk about a few working group essentials. And Lou, I know you and I talked about saying a few words about the mission. I have a slide for that in just a few seconds. So let me tee that up here briefly and say, this is the members of our little working group here. In addition, I see that Dr. Sharon Robinson has joined us as well. Hello, Sharon. I appreciate that very much. I had suggested that she would make a great addition to the scoop, and I appreciate that she has taken the time to join us as well. So she's not on this list here, but you hopefully find yourself on this list. If you are missing for some reason, then let me know. We'll add you to the list, and I'll add you to the bios that I've been sending around. You can see that we have members from the Kentucky Board of Education, the Kentucky Education Association, the Student Voice Team, and then Brian and I from the Center for Assessment. Hopefully you've seen by now the bios that I've sent around, that you can also, at least some of them, you can access relatively easily on the Kentucky Department of Ed website. And if you want to contact members of this group, you can just go into one of the meeting invites that for one of these meetings like this, and you can see all the email addresses or even the emails that I've sent to you, and that should be relatively easy to do. You should always feel free to reach out to me. You can do that either by texting me, I guess, on my phone. The phone number is right here, or sending me an email at arub@ncie.org. And I actually think that that would be a very meaningful way to engage with one another, because as you'll see in a minute, you're quite a diverse group, and you have very diverse backgrounds and experiences and learning needs. And I want to make sure that I do what I can in the next 4 weeks to support you on your journey of learning and help us together create the kind of outcomes that are expected from us from the side of the board. So that might require some one-on-one additional follow-ups, and I'll be gladly doing that. If I can. So just, don't hesitate to ask me a question or share a suggestion with me one-on-one. All right, and so with this, I want to talk about the goals of the working group. Instead of just reading them out, I was talking with Lou and I said, since you're here and you're the current chair of the board, why don't you say a few words about what you want the mission of this particular group to be, and maybe say a few additional words about the context of the 3 working groups. So Lou, do you mind going ahead and doing that?
No, thank you so much, Andre, and thanks for including me in the planning and the conversations we've gotten ready for today. And thanks to all the members. I don't think I have had a chance to meet all of you, but I am Lou. Please call me Lou for the purpose of inclusion in this group. I would recommend that we use first names. Andre and I talked about that a bit to make sure we are all equal colleagues and partners in this work. And thank you for joining us today. Um, you may know about the Kentucky United We Learn Council. Some of you overlap as members and technical advisors to that group. And then others of you serve in the roles that you saw on the list that Andre provided. United We Learn is Kentucky's initiative to move forward a bold new future for all learners in Kentucky and a path to deeper learning, more personalized learning through vibrant learning experiences, innovation, especially as it relates to assessment and accountability, and then deep community engagement. So as part of that work, we have been now for 2.5 years talking with people around Kentucky about what their aspirations are for all of our kids. And so we're getting some traction. We're making some big moves. We're coming up with ideas. We just had 2 days, week before last, with the second convening of the full United We Learn Council. And so as we get more and more strategic and as we drill down into this work, the board is simultaneously developing a learning agenda of our own, a set of goals that are internal facing as well as external facing, so that we can, as a board team, be as knowledgeable about the landscape of assessment and accountability design in the US today. And then as we think about what that means for our learning agenda and our work ahead as a state board. So to that end, you may recall, board members, at the April meeting, we looked at a first draft of our call to action, our learning agenda, and these work groups you approved at that meeting are an outgrowth of that effort. So I brought up United We Learn and the learning agenda so that you'll see that these are simultaneous and interconnected efforts to move the Commonwealth forward on the part of the state board and certainly our partners at KBE. So as you look at our goals, we are the assessment experiences and practices. So as we begin to think what it might look like for us to reimagine, to innovate around assessment and accountability moving forward, post No Child Left Behind, what might that look like? So primarily our goal is to think about foundational design principles with a future orientation in mind, aligned with the work of the Cool Council, those 3 big ideas. Secondarily, this was Andre's idea and I really love it. This kind of work, excuse me, I find to be very helpful in my own thinking, and that as a team, we would create a theory of action around which the state assessment accountability system might begin to take shape, and that we would begin sharing that in a strategic way with the board, with the department, with the Cool Council, with General Assembly, men and women, and other stakeholders. And then thirdly, a personal goal for us as members of this team. I hope you find it an edifying experience so that we all have a better understanding of what state assessment work in Kentucky looks like now, but really what kind of frontier, what kind of new world of innovation and assessment and accountability can lie ahead. So I hope you find that it's a point of learning and growth for you as a professional, as a partner, and as a thinker. Special thanks to Andre and his team, Brian and others from the Center for Assessment. We are in good hands with these really, really smart people who are on the cutting edge of assessment and accountability in Kentucky. And then special thanks, you'll see members of our own Kentucky Department of Education Office of Assessment and Accountability. Rhonda and her team, Jennifer, is a member of our group, who are so generously kind to go on this journey with us, to think while they're in the middle of doing really, really hard assessment work as it is required right now, they have joyfully said, but let's imagine a better way forward. And so that's the work I think we have at hand.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Lou. It's wonderful. And I think actually this might be a good moment to just check in with members of this group, since we have it here and since it's so important, to see whether anybody has any foundational questions about these goals. Is there anything that strikes you as maybe unexpected or something that you'd like to know right away?
Does this sound like the bus you meant to get on?
That's right. There we go. Buses. I like
It
it.
does.
Okay, so then, don't worry about, or is there somebody? Did I just hear somebody say something?
This is Lee. I was going to say, I found the report that you gave us to read about things going on in Kentucky. Some of the detail I've been looking for a while, and you're easy on us, and we look forward to the comparisons with what's going on in other states as well. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah, so you're referring to the report from the AISC committee. That's the Acceleration Innovation Standing Committee, which is one of the three committees under the Cool Councils, since we were talking about that earlier. So there's also a Vibrant Learning Experiences Committee and a Bold New Future / Policy Committee. Yeah, so that was the report. Glad that you found that useful. And it also reminds me to remind all of you that there is this G Drive, this Google Drive, that I've created where that report lives and the supporting documentation for that report lives, as well as initial references from the literature that are associated with the survey responses that you gave in this intake survey that I'm going to talk about in just a few seconds. So if you have any access problems with that, as simple as that, or you would like additional resources, again, don't hesitate to contact me. All right, with that in mind, let's get started. Let's talk about the proposed timeline. So we only have 4 weeks, really, which is a very short, compact timeline. And I think we want to be reasonable, which is why in the goals that we have articulated on the previous page, you see a sort of like dedicated focus to design principles and a theory of action along with learning, rather than sort of a broad one-size-fits-all solution that sounds great but needs to be thought through much, much further. That's the job of the upcoming months and even the upcoming years. So in order to get there, the proposal here is this. Today, we're going to talk about the committee work. We're doing that right now, talk about the survey, and then we actually want to embrace a little bit the time that we have here and spend about, I would say, half an hour just talking about some assessment foundations and assessment here writ large, not just simply state assessment, even though that's the context, the space in which we're primarily operating, but just to get a sense of where innovations are going in the field, what some common terms mean, and just treat that as a learning moment without any pressure to immediately act upon that information. But with that in mind, and some additional experiences from case studies that you're going to get in preparation of next week, I think you'll be much more equipped even to think in a principled way about these principles and the theory of action that you're being asked to co-create. Next week, we're going to talk about state assessment approaches through some examples. And the examples are chosen so that they have a competency-based education at KBE flavor and the portraits of a graduate, portraits of a learner kind of flavor. And then in the next week, there's no meeting. And you're going to have some homework where you can work together on a representation of the theory of action and some initial language for these recommendations and design principles that this working group has to come up with at the end of the month. And then in the final week, hopefully we can finalize that and think about some additional tactical strategic recommendations or whatever else seems really helpful at that moment so that we can put all of that thinking and all of the representations and language into that call to action document. So that's my plan for our month together. So hopefully that'll work out. All right, we already looked at that. I want to quickly start off by looking at the survey responses with you. So for those of you, if there's anybody here on the call who was not part of the communication beforehand, I created an intake survey for our members here and asked them a few questions that had to do with their wishes, their questions, their previous experiences, and some of their comfort levels around different principles. So this is a high-level summary of those. And the first thing I want to start off with is to say we had these questions about how clear are you on different aspects. The first two here were the goals of the working group and the way the goals of this working group cohere with the goals of the other working groups. It sounded just initially that hopefully you feel a little bit more comfortable with what we are being asked to do. But I want you to keep that also in mind, because I think we all have to work together to foster that kind of coherence and make sure we build bridges across the other working groups. For example, I actually took the time to attend both of the other working group meetings this week just to get a sense of what the conversations are like. And I'm going to bring in any insights that might help us with our work into this conversation. But if there's any other ideas that you have along the way for how we can enhance the coherence, we're open to hearing them and seeing if we can act upon them. Then there's a variety of questions that had to do with how assessment work is being conducted in different committees and in different initiatives in the state. So, Lee, you said that you found it helpful to read that report because there is indeed a little bit, at least, of an overview of some of the work of the initiatives. So, for example, there's short little component reports where we ask the initiative leaders some strategic questions about, what their priorities are, what their milestones are, how they're going about assessment and accountability work, and you can get at least a high-level sense of that. So that might be helpful to you if you haven't taken a look at that yet. As far as the assessment work in the AISC and the co-council, I think the answer is that there is, on the one hand, definitely some work that's going on that is consistent, but there's also still the need to bring this all into coherence. And just for clarity, you may know that there is a grant application that has been funded called the Competitive Grant for State Assessment. I put that entire application, the public version of that, into the G Drive as well. And in that, you can sort of see what that particular line of work is funding. And in many ways, it gives the State Department and the state the degree of freedom to really explore and innovate, especially around assessment and accountability. So there's some deliverables called out there that have to do with like a systems bank that we can think about designing or importing our solutions into, and other kinds of future-oriented work that have to do with reimagining assessment and accountability practices and solutions. So that exists as well, and that guides to some degree the Cool Council and AISC work in particular, but that work is also broader, just for context. So hopefully throughout this week, we'll get a little bit more, this month, excuse me, we'll get a little bit more clarity on some of these. You definitely, I heard that several of you have a need to get more information about the work specifically, so we'll see what we can do for you on that. The next aspect of that had to do with the comfort that you all have with some, I call them here applied issues. So this is really sort of these conceptual buckets that people often talk about when they talk about assessments. And I collected these and put them in front of you for multiple purposes. So one is I really did want to know, what your level of comfort is. And as I said, your comfort is an informal kind of concept, right? It could mean being able to explain this to somebody, being able to read new resources and put them into sort of a mental context. It could also mean to actually make certain design decisions or strategic planning decisions within that space. And so I understand there's a big wiggle room for what that actually may mean, but nevertheless, I think it was interesting to see some general trends. The color coding on the right-hand side is essentially green means more of you than not feeling comfortable. The red means more of you than not are feeling not quite as comfortable, and the yellow one is it's a kind of a mixed bag. And what I saw from that is you all seem to be pretty comfortable with formative assessment practices and the use of assessment information for accountability systems. And, there's a mixed level of comfort when it comes to all of these assessment concepts that are really integral and interwoven into the current practices and the current initiatives. So interim and through course assessment, performance-based assessment, portfolio assessments, and curriculum embedded assessment. Some of you are not very comfortable with that, others are. When it comes to the more sort of technical and maybe to some way also like the edges of the assessment space, you're all a little bit less comfortable with that. And some of you even said, I don't even know what this means. So what is social cognitive or social cultural assessment? And that's a good question. So I put, for each of these, I put at least one reference in the folder where those of you who are interested in that, you could get an entry point into thinking about these issues. And again, the point is not to become an expert in 4 weeks on all of these. That's wouldn't be at all reasonable. But it's also to say, look, am I even aware that there is areas like this that might be worth going into? And then on the technical issues front, somewhat of a similar picture, although I feel more people felt like they wanted to learn a little bit more, especially about technical issues. And if I go to the next page, when it came also to sort of the data analysis and the data consideration kinds of aspects. Don't worry, nobody has to know anything in depth about user interface and user experiences. I did put that in here because, when you think about modern technology and people start talking about dashboards and, companies either try to sell you dashboards or present dashboards to you, or you're being asked to think about, the way assessment or accountability information can be reported in a future web interface. This kind of comes up like that there's a sort of a big development lift and there's principles and practices around that. But that's not necessarily for you to work on. I just wanted to sort of call that out, that is an area of work. So what I'm going to do with this information, I first of all recognize that you're not a very homogeneous group in terms of your experiences. I'm trying to customize my resources and my engagement with you as much as I can. And also, you should see each other as a resource. I think that's a really important part of this as well. I know you all have limited time, but you can see that there's people in this team that could really benefit from your personal experience in one of these areas. So I hope that you also don't hesitate maybe sometimes to reach out to one another and say like, look, he was talking about this one concept. I'm not quite sure about this. Did you understand this? Do you have anything else that might be helpful here? And maybe even work together if you have the time on in pairs or with a colleague, with a friend on these little homework assignments that we have, because I find that really helps. Finally, some noteworthy themes. Let me see what I want to quickly highlight. I think in terms of dreaming, most of you were sort of saying like, look, essentially, if we could have a better world, we want to see more differentiated assessment that leverages technology better. We want to see more project-based assessment, especially also for individuals and not just in collaborative settings. We want more just-in-time testing that provides quicker feedback, and I would interpret that as saying more meaningful. And we also want to have a little bit more of a way to assess collaboration skills in particular. And I would imagine along with collaboration skills come some of these other skills in the portrait of a graduate that currently get called out. Non-negotiables is the focus on the portrait of a graduate and state legislation requirements, not surprisingly. And there were some other recommendations for that you can see here for ideas that might be worthwhile pursuing. You did express, and I thought this was interesting, that we don't want to lose sight of actionable goals. We don't want to forget about pedagogical aspects. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. And it's a pretty broad topic. So some of you said, well, I'm not quite sure how I can make a contribution. And then one person even said, like, look, I hope that if we don't go too far into this performance-based assessment, essentially, we might actually make students less prepared if we reduce standardized assessments too much. So there's also some tension represented about what is sort of a worthwhile innovation moving forward. And I think that's good to recognize. And finally, I want to call out, because we're doing this together as a team, that this is what you said in terms of how much time everybody has. And by the way, I really appreciate that you did take the time to say that, because it helps me to create tasks that are reasonable and engage with you in ways that are not overshooting on complexity or on demands. So essentially, the majority of you said, look, no more than 2 hours a week is what I can offer to this outside of the 1 hour that we are meeting. And I think that's a reasonable time. I'll try to create something for you where you can spend some of the time reading and then hopefully some of the time creating or reacting to some output in the upcoming weeks. All right, I want to stop there briefly and see whether anybody has anything that they want to share when they were sort of having these responses read back out to them, or something that they want to voice that has to do with their learning needs or other kinds of aspects that stand out to them.
This is Lee. I just have a technical question. I
Yeah.
got through the G Drive, the first document, but I haven't been able to get access to anything since then. So I just need somebody to look at that, or somebody from the technical side give me a buzz tomorrow maybe, and we can talk my way through it. But I got the first document, but haven't seen one come through since then.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you should all, on the G drive, you should all be able to click on that folder and it should have multiple subfolders on it. But let me double check that. Then can always, maybe there's some kind of permission issue, and if not, I'll reach out to you and I'll help you find your way through it. No
That'd
problem.
be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else? Anything that they want to say? Okay. I want to spend the next time talking with you about some systemic descriptions and some assessment foundations. I want to check in with you along the way. And today is a little bit more me talking. Next 2 weeks is more you talking. But I thought it might be good for us to sort of level set on a few of these foundational concepts. So as I'm doing this, what I would love for you to do is, if you have any questions or maybe considerations that come to your mind or ideas that this sparks, could you please put that in the chat? And there's two reasons for this. Number one is we can monitor the chat and take a quick look and see whether there's something we want to address along the way. But also, I will have access to the chat after this meeting, and then I can follow up with you and share sort of pointers and additional resources on things that may not have been clear. Does that sound good? Anybody have a question on that? Okay. All right, I want to start off with systems descriptions. And I'm going to do this because there's a lot of concepts floating around that we had in the initiatives, project-based learning, competency-based education, deeper learning. And I want us to be sensitive to the way we sort of take a picture, sort of my analogy. So whenever somebody says like, hey, can you articulate a theory of action, for example, like we have, or can you talk about design principles? It's really important to say, well, what's my frame in which I'm doing this, right? How far should I zoom out or zoom in? And so it's really good to talk a little bit about how different people might describe different systems. So I thought I'd start there, and then we're going to talk about some assessment components. So I'm going to call these pedagogical descriptions. So here's some stuff that you may have seen. So first of all, this you definitely have seen. This is the Kentucky Portrait of a Graduate. But even that, that's a frame, right? So we talk about the idea of this being something that is implemented in some way. But if you look at a representation like this, it's really just a description of a variety of persona, essentially, like the person who is an engaged citizen, is a critical thinker, is an effective communicator, with underlying competencies, skills, knowledge, and abilities, right? And so when somebody says, well, what does it mean to implement this? I want us all to think systemically, right? Because what it requires is curricular practices with formative assessment practices, with appropriate teacher professionalization, with appropriate unit-based assessments or tasks, performance-based tasks, all the way up to defenses of learning, for example, or expositions of learning, along with meeting certain kinds of eventual graduation requirements. So this system is really a big component of having conversation about the role of assessment in relationship to something like the portrait of a graduate. So I wanted to call that out for starters. If you look at the literature and you look at people who have written about competency-based education, you also see descriptions of learning models often. So here in Kentucky, you'll see that probably a lot if you listen to people talking about the PBL Works initiative, for example, or PBL project-based learning in general, but also in the deeper learning initiative, right? People will sort of say, this is our pedagogical model of how we believe and what the literature and the science says about how students are learning. And so therefore we have this as the model that we're implementing in terms of curriculum and assessment and so on and so forth. So whatever the model is, I think, when we are critically analyzing what's going on in the different initiatives, it's good to sort of say, well, can you tell me about how you conceptualize your model of learning that students are sort of engaged in? And this is one of them, but you may have seen others. There's also conception of things like learning progressions and others. But so the point here is systemic or conceptual descriptions of models of learning are really important to understand how we design and interpret assessment information.
And Andre, before you go to the next slide,
yeah,
one of those authors, Chris Sturgis, was in Kentucky around the same time that this publication was published, and she helped us a lot to frame the original anchor competencies. So there was a good cross current there with Chris.
Yeah, and Chris has written fantastic work. I really personally love that. There's a lot of good resources that exist in that ecosystem. I put a few of these in the library, but yeah, glad to hear that there's that tight connection. And yeah, and by the way, this makes me think. So, for example, Lou, if you sit there and you're like, "Oh, let me see what Andre put in there," and you see 2 or 3 citations from that work, but you feel like there's something missing, you have editorial access to that entire folder. So anyone can add other kinds of resources that they think others should know about. And of course, we can all write each other an email. So that's a good opportunity there. Anybody else want to react on this first piece about Portrait of a Graduate? Because I know it's a big conversational topic and theories of learning. Anything that anybody wants this brings up for anybody?
This is Lee. Yeah, I've been excited about project-based learning and the literacy work that's being done. But in my mind, the ultimate idea is, how do you assess whether it's effective or not? You can have a whole lot of projects and do a whole lot of things, but we have to still convince parents and teachers and students and legislators that this assessment piece is going to be real. So I do think it's good to look at the different ways we teach. And with each of those modules, how do we assess that to see if it's being effective or not? So that hangs it together for me.
Yeah, and there's that effectiveness at different levels also, right? So there's the effectiveness for individual students to develop. Then there is effectiveness in the sense of at certain, it means different things, obviously, in different grades and different grade spans. So if you get closer to graduation, there's the effectiveness in terms of preparedness at the early literacy in early grades is early literacy and throughout its social emotional development and other kinds of in sort of cross-cutting competencies. But yeah, that's a good point. And I know, Sharon, you had been talking about that as well, to me at least, in the last time we met. And I know I've heard you say a few times, speak to the importance of rigorous or trustworthy evidence of the effectiveness, right? Either of particular programs or interventions or even the system overall.
Yeah, I found that this introduction or grounding, if you will, in terms of what kind of system are we talking about, helpful, because it's a complexity of dynamics here. You've got the curriculum, you've got the outcomes that are articulated for the curriculum, you've got how you document those outcomes in a way that is, I'm using the old vernacular, that is reliable and valid. And then how do you make that information useful for the learner first, but also for the sponsors, for those who are worried about supporting a system of education that really is useful to students and useful to our community. So there's several different levels here, but I just hope that we never get so distracted by what's easy to measure and have that stand for everything, when what is essential to measure, the complexities just allow us to gloss over it, to the point where we are now, and which is a serious worry, that we are connecting with students in a way that allows them to devote themselves to the task at hand in preparation of, their life's work and preparation for a fulfilling contribution to their communities.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And I'll just hook onto one particular idea in this, which is this notion of, measuring what matters, right? And evidence that matters or evidence for what matters. That's really what we're after. And so you'll hear me today and in the upcoming weeks really try to frame assessment as inclusive and broad as I can, not in a wishy-washy sense, but to say that evidence assessment practices are really about, instructional and learning support, but they're also about evidence-based reasoning. So I'm going to have a few slides in a few minutes that sort of lay the foundation for that. Because I feel like even if you engage with people in conversations about like modern conceptions of validity or reliability and, how can taking traditional notions to be problematic, you typically still end up in sort of at least a similar space. And people still want, they may say, well, I don't care about the reliability coefficient. That has been too limiting. It has been, traditional unidimensional skills. We don't want that. But people still want evidence that they can trust. And they want evidence that has meaning. So they want some version of consistency in the information that they're collecting, even if people are learning over time and are productively changing, and they do want also meaningfully. They want to understand how they can use reports and data to make important, productive, and effective decisions. So we can have conversations about how we can foster that. So I wanted to quickly, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on and want to quickly talk about a few systemic perspectives. So these are just examples of things that you may have come across and that represent a particular entry point into thinking about the role of assessment. So here's a table that I know you've seen if you were at the board meeting where Lillian and Jonathan presented, because it's from their particular slide deck. And I really like this simple summary here. So this is a comparison of the different affordances of traditional educational models and competency-based education models. And there's a piece in there in the assessment that speaks about the assessment system. But so if we take, again, a picture and say, hey, we want to talk about competency-based education models, the implementation of that, facilitators, barriers, there's research that helps us understand at that level what the roles and the affordances of assessments and assessment systems can be. So that's one entry point. So this is the one that we were talking about, Sharon, you were just talking about in terms of the interconnectedness, and you as well, the interconnectedness of the different aspects that have to come together in a local system of continuous improvement, right? So here we have the interaction between professional practices, student experiences, the culture in the school, the district and the school systems, and then you have mediating factors, outcomes, and drivers of these. And so assessment is sort of infused and cutting across in various of these particular areas, right? So the student experiences is in part an assessment experience. The culture will make use of data in certain ways, qualitative or quantitative data. Professional practices are also leveraging assessment information, both for curricular purposes, for teaching and pedagogical purposes, or for summative evaluation purposes, or whatever the use case might be. And then, of course, district and school systems for their management, they need assessment information, but also partly for federal accountability. So another perspective. Then
Again,
there's also,
really,
yeah, please go ahead.
pardon my interruption, Andre. Back
No,
to that
it's good.
slide. Again, really
Yeah.
vibing on Chris's work here. I wanted to just make sure everybody had a moment to linger on the outcomes gray bar, because this really does capture so much of multiple conversations we've had at the state board, noting that the kind of outcomes that matter in this kind of competency portrait of a learner world include an expanded definition of student success. So what we've seen over time with large scale, top-down education reform, assessment and accountability initiatives has been that those measures of success became very limiting over time. But instead, thinking about how we expand the definition of student success, and then notice that they describe it as backward engineering, so that what the assessment and accountability system then begins to shape the learner experience, and they're very symbiotic. They're moving forward with the same kinds of outcomes in mind. And then the last leg there to drive continuous improvement around those agreed upon outcomes.
Beautiful. I love it. No, that's fantastic. And I'm going to hook onto the idea of the backwards design, right? Because in many ways, so this kind of a picture is sort of almost like a meta level of a theory of action. So when we do our theory of action articulation, we give some meat to this. And then, the idea is exactly what you said, backwards designing the system from that. And then assessment in itself, as I have a few slides on that in a minute, is also essentially the practice of backwards design. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So it's a lot of backwards designing, but in order to backwards design, you do need to know where you want to end up, right? And at least have some initial clarity on that. And I will also say my background is both, assessment, research methodology, measurement, and also teaching English to speakers of other languages or applied linguistics. So language matters a lot, right? And it's actually often really hard to find language that really captures the core ideas that people can agree with or disagree with. So I think we'll spend as much time as we have in our short initial month on really trying to wrestle a little bit with language to sort of capture, finding statements that capture what we're really after. And I think that is both an art and a science to some degree. All right, so here's a different system overview. I want to show this to you as well. So there's people like my colleague Juan who have written about accountability and improvement systems. So you can even sort of zoom in and say, let's talk about the way we design and implement our accountability system into which assessment is a component, and how do we maintain that system and have a culture just around that system. So it's another way of looking at that. Finally, in this section, I want to talk a little bit about thematic description. So we talked about systems, and before that, we talked about these pedagogical perspectives. So there's also thematic entry points that people take. And I wanted to highlight 3 of these for you just to remind you that they exist out there and see what resonates. So the first thing is the themes in the United We Learn report, right? So these are taken in a copy and paste, just copied and pasted there, in other words, from the United We Learn report. So if you just scan these briefly, there's probably some ideas that you can see reflected in these, or some features, right? So, I mean, I see things like, a very humanistic and inclusive and sort of social process flavor of that. I also feel like it's very has this aspirational flavor for the system. And then some aspects of some of these statements are more about specific, particular outcomes, and they hook onto particular specific ideas. But it has a very social flavor to me. Let's compare that to some other statements. So here's 12 illustrative design principles, we call them, from our report. So there's text that goes with them, just like in the United We Learn report. And so you can see these, and, to me, the first 4 are sort of tactical in a systemic sense, like assessment in the support of vibrant learning experiences for marginalized students or all students, considering all students, marginalized students at the center, empowering students, and then systemically making sure it reflects labor needs. Then the next 4 are sort of have a strong value flavor, and then the last 4 are almost very tactical, right? So this was the way we sort of broke that up. And it's a different kind of way of structuring, thinking about like what we want of an assessment system to be. These are not, by the way, definitive. This was just something where Susan and I and others were trying to make sense of the work that people had done and sort of translating it into something that they can react to and make it actionable. The goal here is to actually have it socialized across committees. So sort of engaging in this process that we're currently engaging in, actually. And then the third one is also, for example, another one. So Lou, you recognize this probably. Yeah, so this idea of thinking about educational systems and the assessment systems from a perspective of equity. And equity is a systemic issue. It's not an issue of an individual assessment. It's not something you can sort of look at a task and say, is this an equitable task? It's sort of like a task that has certain features, but it's really about the implementation of the individual assessment and the assessment in a system that creates different kinds of opportunities and access conditions, especially in connection with the curricula and the teacher professionalization. And so here you see purpose and culture, structure, and pedagogy are called out in different ways. All right, I don't want to belabor this more. Like, we're not going to take each one of these and work them in detail because I don't think that's particularly productive. I just wanted to show you and sensitize you a little bit to this idea that framing really matters. And I know it's in some ways obvious. We think about this all the time, but I want us together in the next 4 weeks really to think about, how are we framing these recommendations that we're going to give at the end of the month, right? So I want to plant the seed early and have you think about, like, how do we want to talk about this? And there's no fully right answer. There's probably some silly things that we can avoid, but there's no singular right answer. Like, we have to come to some consensus and say, like, look, this kind of framing for us is meaningful, productive, given the constraints that we're currently working under. And this hopefully helps others to act upon that. And so, yeah, I hope that makes sense for you. Any reactions to this? Let me take a quick pause here before I go into the modern assessment conception section.
You're just getting a lot of love in the chat.
Did you say love in the chat? I'm not multitasking, because that sometimes gets me distracted, especially in Teams. I don't want to close something accidentally, but that's good. Yes. But is there something that resonated with you, or that you disagree with? Someone says, like, yeah, well, that didn't quite make sense to me, or I thought about this differently. And if not, it's okay. I'll just move on. Just want to give you an opportunity to share. Okay. Polly, it was a very broad question. So let's just move on to the next piece. And as you're engaging with the next task, I think some of these ideas you'll have to simply wrestle with them because of the way I wrote the task. So hopefully they'll give some more additional meat and grounding to these. So modern assessment conceptions. What do I want to talk about? So first of all, let's talk about assessment as evidence-based reasoning. All right. Sounds pretty straightforward, and actually it is at a high level, right? So the idea evidence-based reasoning is a practice that exists in a variety of disciplines. And so here, a graphic about evidence-based reasoning, about creating schemata and going from intuition, early perceptions to decision-making through a systematic process. There's a quotation that I found that I liked, and so I just put it here. Let's talk about assessment as evidence-based reasoning. So what is this about? So this is one of two slides, and you don't have to read. It's not about reading all the details. What it's really about is to say, like, look, on the left-hand side where there says inferences, you see there's A, B, C, D from the bottom up to the top. And then on the next slide, it goes on E, F, G. And the idea is that if A is this idea that you start in any kind of assessment, well, typically in any kind of assessment, yeah, I would say in any kind of assessment, I'm going to say that. You start with some kind of analysis of the domain, the kind of, competencies and skills that you want to develop or that you want to assess that are relevant. And then you do certain kinds of things. You design assessments or tasks. You score these kinds of tasks. You analyze the scores. You implement you report them back, and you make decisions based on these. You evaluate the system, and so on and so forth. So this idea that, that the scores or the feedback means something on an assessment is a relatively complicated process. And that argument actually, in many cases, has multiple steps in it, sort of this complicated chain where you make a bunch of design decisions along the way, and at the end, you try to convince people that essentially these stories that you're telling about people based on the way they performed on these tasks that you've created in some kind of systematic ways are meaningful, and they kind of hold up in some way across certain kinds of contexts. And I'm saying all of this in this way because, hey, even if you have performance-based assessments and you say, like, oh, look, We believe that based on this defense that students have been creating, based on all the materials that they've collected, the annotations, I learned something about this student. And I see, of course, socio-emotionally, how they've developed over time. And you build an argument and you're calling certain things out that you call evidence. Data isn't evidence, but you say these things have meaning in this process. And so what I want us, the reason I'm bringing this up is just to say, like, look, we need to be critical consumers, right? So when anybody tries to sort of say, we have a process in which we standardize and systematically design something and implement something, I want us to be saying, like, just explain it to me, right? Like, explain to me why this argument that you're building makes sense. Why, and this could be qualitative sources of evidence, can be testimonials, it could be empirical data, but that's the idea of assessment. And so in the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to do something that is maybe, it might feel a bit intense, but I think you can handle it, which is essentially I'm going to walk through some of these lines in this table. What I've done here is I've essentially sliced and diced the space of assessment into a variety of categories and just listed some common considerations. And the reason why I've done this is because I think it is really, really good to be able to sort of say, and do I mean this or do I mean that? Am I, and what are all of these considerations that come together when somebody has either created an assessment or is implementing and designing an assessment system? Like, what do I have to think about, right? Because if we start talking about like design recommendations, they may have to do with evaluating quality or putting into place certain mechanisms. But a lot of things has to be considered, and we need to be careful of, we need to at least understand how complex certain aspects of the work are so that we can make good recommendations. So here, for example, you see this list here on the left hand, these labels are chosen by me. They're not, fully grabbed out of nowhere, but they're to some degree a little bit personal flavor on some of these. I just wanted to find a different word for a different category of ideas. So for example, when somebody says, like, let's talk about assessment, scope, what are we talking about? An individual assessment, a suite of assessment? Are we also going to consider the context in which the assessment is being implemented, curricular context, teacher professionalization? Do we talk about the way we've engaged stakeholders along the way, like the social aspect of this? The focus, are we going to talk about out-of-school assessment experiences or just in-classroom assessment experiences? Are we talking about at the level of the school, the district, the state, federal, or even are we looking at international comparisons as part of this? The next one I think is really important. I don't know whether you share this, but in my experience, a lot of conversations about assessment design are highly dominated by middle and high school. They're highly dominated by math, then science, then maybe ELA, and other things fall through the cracks. But we all know that pre-K, K through 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 10, 11 to 12, there's very different kind of experiences. And even if we talk about like continua of learning and development of skills, like the cognitive and socio-emotional development of children and young adults is very different across these grades. So the assessment learning experiences are very different, and what matters is very different. So, I always like contrasts. I'm like, look, if we want to talk about an assessment system, are we talking about, play experiences and early literacy ideas? Or are we talking about whatever we consider to be college and career readiness at the end of high school? Right? Those are very different kind of conversation. They're almost like different context. You need to talk about them. You need to bring them together, but you also give them both space. And I think that often there's a risk that we don't do that enough. So purposes, right? So you can see that here. Are we talking about formative check-ins? Are we talking about summative determination, system modeling, federal accountability? Some of you asked about NAEP and PISA. So under types here, I put in things like, NAEP and PISA are educational surveys. No individual scores are given. It's just about monitoring systems nationally, internationally. Similar to, but also different from state summative tests, interim assessments. That's different from literacy screeners or diagnostic assessments. There's performance tasks, informal checks. That's all different. You can have a recognition, right, around assessments. Like, are we giving badges, micro certificates, credentials? How is this related to grading practices? Credits are based on performances. That's a form of assessment. And then design, to what degree might want to talk about principled assessment design, design patterns, task templates, technology affordances. Competencies, we already made some decisions here in the portrait of a learner, so I'm going to take that out. I'm going to tasks, I already mentioned this. But motives, right? So you have assessments. Is it an individual assessment? Somebody mentioned in their desires more individual performance-based assessment. Is it collaborative? Is it mentor guided? Is the task designed with a division of expertise? Is it gamified? If so, why? So we could think about that, right? Then delivery, paper, digital, mixed. What are the work products that are coming out of this? What are the opportunities for extracting evidence? So some people talk about that and consider that a lot. Scoring, some of you asked about complex scoring, right? So there's machine scoring, the automated scoring of selected response tasks and multiple choice tasks, that kind of stuff. And then there's like short answers, essays, products, that can be scored individually by machines in a hybrid form with committees, all of that. Reporting, right? That's an important part of assessment. It often gets underappreciated as well. So this idea of like, how do we give people access to the data? Who has access? Can they interact with the data? Can they sort of like sort it, download it, get different representation, or is it a static report? So report cards, that brings up all kinds of data engineering and data governance issues. Timing, when is the assessment given? Quality, like what are we talking about? Like what is our framework for quality? What do we care about in what situation? Scalability, how hard is it to scale this? What is needed for scaling of these solutions? And then programmatically, what's the theory of change that we are having or action? Are we pursuing any kind of program evaluation or validation argumentation purposes? Do we consider equity? Do we need to care about federal peer review? And who has control over the assessment? So this is like the greatest hits of some of the high level ideas around assessments. And so again, nobody can work all of this, and nobody would work all of this for all kinds of purposes. But the point is, there are systematic ways in which we can think about the dimensions and the aspects that matter, and we can be sensitive to that. And I hope we can all try to help each other be as sensitive and as sort of aware of that as we can as we're creating the outcomes. So I have exactly 3 minutes. That's not too bad, actually. So here's my homework for you for next time. And the good news is next time you don't have to listen to me quite as much. You can we're going to start by you sharing out some of this work that you have done. And here's what I would love for you to do. So in the folder, there is these 2 resources at the bottom here that if you click on the slide deck, which is also in there, you could just click on it directly, or you can type it into your web browser, and I'll send you an email where I'll also put this in here. This is essentially high-level overview articles that give you a sense of like what's going on in different states in the country. I'll put in 1 or 2 other ones there with examples, like, hey, what happened with the New Hampshire PACE program? What's happening in Colorado? What are some of these states that are doing similar kinds of things? And what I would love for you to do is just scan these 2 pieces. They're not too long, and just say like, oh, here's 1 or 2 examples I've always wanted to learn something about. There's hyperlinks in there where you can get access to the resources. So pick 1 for starters, 1 that resonates for you. Maybe make a mental note of why that one resonated with you. Like, why do you think this is a good one to learn something about? And the first task, to keep it simple, is just to say like, look, what do you appreciate about this? What aspects do you find problematic? And what could the board in Kentucky really learn from this example? And that last part is really about like, look, at the end, we have to make some recommendations for the board, and we have to come up with some design principles. So if you were to extract anything that's valuable, that, what might this be? So but the first one is a little bit broader. So just like getting you to engage with it, reflect back on it in a way that's meaningful to you. Now, the nice to do is, to actually put some language and some things that this example inspires you to do. Just like, you can look at the examples that we have, just like some statements where you start playing with this language of like, what might I say a design principle is? Doesn't have to be just a phrase. You could put some additional text around that if you wanted to. And it's getting you essentially into the habit of, or reminding you, if you've done this in the past, of how you've how one creates these, because that's what we have to do, and formally to some degree sign off in a few weeks. So that would be the nice to do. And then if you're really motivated, that's number 3. And if you have extra time, here's a good one, I think, which is, I gave you a bunch of themes and design principles, right? So you could look at the system that you have and say, well, if I had to make some judgment about whether this system is sort of, and I use the language, right, oriented toward the themes, is in alignment with the design principles, what might I say? And what you probably find is that you often might go like, I guess I don't really know. I have to operationalize this a little bit. I have to think through what I really mean by the different aspects, But that's the point. The point is not to have the answers. The point is to wrestle with this and sort of learn where you get stuck. And when you say, I need to have certain kinds of information in a certain kind of way so that I can make some of these judgments, because when we have our theory of actions, we have to have these outcomes and these principles and the values at the one end, constraints on the one end, mechanisms in the middle, and outcomes at the end. And, at some point, people are like, well, how are you going to evaluate that you're actually making progress toward these, right? And this is sort of where, what do we consider evidence? What is the link? What's the bridges that we're building? We need to get to that point. And this is sort of a low-key way for you to just play with that. I don't care which state you choose. Pick the one that resonates with you. You can do it individually. You can do it with somebody. I actually personally like doing it with somebody typically, but you can do it by yourself. I don't care. And write it up in a way that works for you. Just, and then, make it public, like either put it in the folder. I think that's the easiest. And if you have some access problem, let me know. And then next time, for part of the meeting, at least probably for the first half hour, I'm going to have you all share this out a little bit. So probably you're all going to get like 10 minutes. Depends on how many groups I have. I'll see how many people are doing what, and then I'll design the time for you. So somewhere between like 5 and 10 minutes so we can listen to one another and hopefully learn from each other. Yeah, and with that, it's 2 minutes over. Not quite on time. That's the German side in me was, I guess, not quite on, but I appreciate your time. I hope this was helpful to you. Again, reach out to me in the upcoming week with questions, with additional ideas. I'm here for you. And anything else, Lou, you want to say since we're at the end?
No, but many, many thanks, Andre. That was a master class in assessment. Reminded me of a lot of things that I needed to be reminded of. The framing was super helpful, and I know we've asked people to jump on and go fast with us, but all of the resources that you're providing will be really helpful in that process. So thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks to everybody.
Okay, yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.